Hello again. For a change, I'm going to read a paper which I wrote for the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, 4th series, volume 11, 1996. The title is E.M., that's Ernest Mason, E.M. Sato's Early Publications, a Founding Father of Modern Japanology, E.N.C. Ruxton. Okay. Ernest Mason Sato was the son of a Swedish merchant who had migrated from Riga to England in 1825, and of an English mother whose maiden name became his middle name. He was born at Clapton in northeast London on June the 30th, 1843. By the way, when I write Swedish, his father was ethnically German. All right. Okay. After a strict Lutheran upbringing and early education at Mill Hill School, that's in London, he was admitted to University College London at the age of 16. Bright and studious, he received his BA degree 2 years later in the autumn of 1861. He first became interested in Japan when one of his brothers brought home Oliphant's narrative of the Earl of Elgin's mission to Japan. His interest was deepened by an account of Perry's expedition. He then came across a notice in the college announcing competitions for studentships in China and Japan. He entered and was placed first on the list. Given his choice of country, Sato selected Japan, and shortly after graduation, at the age of 18, departed for the Far East. He arrived in Japan in September of 1862 and stayed there, except for 2 seasons of home leave, for a continuous period of 20 years. Much of his published writing stems from this early period of his life. The following will summarize his early published writings from 1865 to 1882. Sato's first published work was The Various Styles of Japanese Writing, a 2-page article in the Chinese and Japanese Repository, number 20, March 1865. And I have a footnote here. The Chinese and Japanese Repository was a short-lived journal edited by James Summers, 1828 to 1891. Summers was born the only son of a sculptor, Edward Summers, in Lichfield, Kent, England. A self-taught scholar of Chinese and Japanese, he is credited with giving the first ever lectures on English literature, that is Shakespeare, in Japan. Remarkably, despite his youth and lack of a university education, 1 year after his return to England from China in 1852, he was appointed Professor of Chinese at King's College, London University. Sato was one of his pupils and was no doubt greatly influenced by Summers. The latter came to Japan in 1873 to teach at the Kaisei Gakko, the forerunner of Tokyo University, on the invitation of the Iwakura Mission. He subsequently taught in Niigata, Osaka, and Sapporo at the Agricultural School. Okay, so let's go back to the main text. So, as I repeat, Sato's first published work was The Various Styles of Japanese Writing, a 2-page article in the Chinese and Japanese Repository, number 20, March 1865. He examines 4 examples of Japanese writing: a specimen of Chinese characters with katakana, Chinese characters and hiragana, gyosho, that's semi-cursive Chinese characters, and hiragana, with the latter written sometimes alongside of the characters, i.e. furigana, and a specimen of a well-educated woman's letter in hiragana. I've shown these in a PowerPoint, which I've done separately. In each case, a Roman letter transcription is provided and an English translation. Some grammatical notes are also given. Sato's intention in publishing this work was to, and this is quoting, throw much light upon a very difficult subject and serve as a guide to some who are commencing the study of this language. In the same year, he then published a translation of the diary of a member of the Japanese embassy to Europe in 1862-3, in the Chinese and Japanese Repository, numbers 24 to 29, July to December 1865. This is subtitled, A Confused Account of a Trip to Europe Like a Fly on a Horse's Tail. The comparison is intended to express the humility of the Japanese author. Sato translated the account of 3 imperial envoys and their retinue who were sent to 6 European countries, quotation mark, to renew the ancient treaties, close quotation mark. He translated the diary for Sir Rutherford Alcock, then British minister in Japan, who was duly impressed with his linguistic ability. In March, April, and May 1866, Sato published an original work in 3 parts called English Policy in the Japan Times. In fact, when it was published in the Japan Times, it had no title. And the title was added when the Japanese translation was produced. So this was later translated into Japanese as Eikoku Sakuron, okay, and taken to be the official British view. However, Sato wrote purely as a private individual. He openly advocated a confederation of the feudal chiefs under the supremacy of the emperor to replace the tycoon or shogun, whose power he sensed was fading. The document was prophetic and may have influenced the course of events. Japanese scholars say it was very influential indeed, even though he was a junior member of the legation and could have no influence on British policy as such. But of course, the title British Policy was only added in the Japanese translation. So that was rather misleading. There followed a period of 4 years in which Sato did not publish. Then in July 1870, he published The Ainos of Yezo. Yezo was the old name for Hokkaido. This appeared as a 2-page article in the Phoenix, #1, which was also edited by James Summers. In it, Sato described the location of Ainu villages, the dress and appearance of Ainu men and women, their diet, and a short word list. In November 1871, Sato wrote again for the Phoenix, #17. This time his topic was An Episode in Japanese History, an extract from a book entitled The History of Taiko-sama. Taiko-sama was an alias for Hideyoshi. The book extended to 84 volumes, published between 1797 and 1802. Sato's extract covers only 2 pages. It is entitled The Armies of Mikatsuki and Mowari Unite to Attack Dani Daizen's Fort. In 1872, Sato read a paper on October the 30th before the Asiatic Society of Japan called Notes on Luchu, which became the opening article in volume 1 of the Journal of the Society. Luchu, of course, is Ryukyu, Okinawa. It describes the history and geography of Luchu, called Ryukyu by the Chinese and Ryukyu by the Japanese. There are accounts of the customs, temperament, and language of the Luchuans, present-day Okinawans. Some fine lithographs of costumes, scenery, etc. are included. Another article in the same journal, called Transactions, was entitled The Geography of Japan. It was read before the Society on March the 22nd, 1873. It sought to correct certain basic errors in Dr. Cornwell's school geography, introduce the divisions of the provinces of Japan, and the names of the main rivers and mountains. I should add a footnote. There's a footnote at the bottom. Sato was a founder member of the Asiatic Society of Japan and contributed various pieces to the published Transactions, and he was president from 1895 to 1900. In 1873, Sato published 2 more translations, this time of Kaikoku Shidan, a history of Japan, and then there's a footnote about that. Kaikoku Shidan was republished in English as Japan 1853 to 64, subtitled Genji Yume Monogatari, The Dream of Genji, in 1905. A photograph of a handwritten letter from Sato to the publisher is included. British Legation, 25th April 1905, Peking. Dear Mr. Watanabe, I am much flattered by your proposal to reprint my translation of the Genji Yume Monogatari, along with the Japanese text and some notes. I willingly give my consent. It is so many years ago since the translation was made that I cannot feel sure that the translation is always correct. But I have no time to revise it, even if I had the original and translations at hand, which I have not. I trust, therefore, that you will correct any mistakes that you find in the translation. Yours very sincerely, Ernest Sato. Okay, so just to go back a bit. In 1873, Sato published 2 more translations, this time of Kaikoku Shidan, a history of Japan from Perry's visit in 1853 to 1864, and Kinsei Shiryaku, from 1853 to the capture of Hakodate by the Mikado's forces in 1869. Again, there's a footnote. Kinsei Shiryaku first appeared as a serialized translation in the Japan Times. It was revised by Shujiro Watanabe, must be Shujiro Watanabe, and republished by the Naigwai Shuppan Kyokai, Tokyo in 1906. Okay, so in between these two, he published a language textbook called Kuaiwa Hen, or 25 exercises in the Yedo colloquial for students such as his fellows in the British legation. Again, there's a footnote. Kuaiwa Hen, printed at the Japan Mail Office, consists of sentences in Romanized Japanese, accompanied by a separate volume of commentary. It was apparently first prepared for A.B. Mitford, later Lord Redesdale, when he was posted to Japan and wanted to learn some Japanese. Sato acknowledged his debt to W.G. Aston for his short grammar of the spoken language and adopted Aston's system of Romanized transliteration. Okay, so Kuaiwa Hen, or 25 exercises in the Edo colloquial. It contains some rather comical scenes between Japanese domestics and their British masters, especially regarding dismissal of servants for various reasons. The following is an extract from the dialogue written in Aston's pre-Hebburn system of Romaji and English. So, Danna-sama, shōshō onegai moshitai koto ga gozaimasu. Nanda? Oyaji ga 9 byō da to moshite, inaka kara tegami ga mairimashita. Dozo 4-5 日を暇をいただきとうございます。手前の親父はよくたびたびわずろうな。また嘘を言って遊びにでも行くんだろう。In English, please sir, may I ask a favor? What is it? A letter has come from the country saying that my father is dangerously ill. May I leave for 4 or 5 days? May I have leave for 4 or 5 days? Your father is always getting something the matter with him. You're telling a lie. The real reason is you want to go and amuse yourself. This is exercise 14 from Kuaiwa Hen. 1874 saw the publication of Sato's first work related to religion, the Shinto temples of Ise. He spelled Shinto S-H-I-N-T-A-U. This was read before the Asiatic Society of Japan on February the 18th, 1874. A detailed description of the shrines is given for the Western visitor, including precise measurements and etymologies, as well as the legend of Izanagi and Izanami. This was followed in 1875 by a closer investigation into the nature of the Shinto religion, entitled The Revival of Pure Shinto, entered as an appendix to Volume 3 of the Transactions of the Asiatic Society of Japan, and revised by the author in 1882. By pure Shinto, Sato meant the religious belief of the Japanese before the introduction of Buddhism and Confucian philosophy into Japan. By its revival, he meant the attempt by a then modern school of writers to present Shinto in its original form. The founder of the modern school was Kada Adzumamaro, born in 1669. Okay, so there's quite a long footnote here about him. Kada no Adzumamaro, 1669 to 1736, was a kokugaku, that's a national learning, scholar and poet. Born into a priestly family in Kyoto, he was educated in the traditions of waka poetry and Shinto scholarship. Considered one of the founders of the kokugaku tradition, he urged that it be officially adopted in place of Confucianism as the ethical underpinning of the state. A modern collection of his complete works, Kada Zenshu, appeared in 1928. So, the founder of the modern school was Kada Adzumamaro. He was followed by Mabuchi, a voluminous writer of poetry. So again, there's a note about him. Kamo no Mabuchi, 1697 to 1769, kokugaku scholar and waka poet. He is known for his contributions to the development of the National Learning School through his studies of the ancient Japanese classics, particularly the Manyoshu, the oldest anthology of Japanese verse, compiled late in the 8th century. He combined the comparative philological research methods of Keichu, 1640 to 1701, with the ethical system of Kada no Adzumamaro. Mabuchi emphasized a Shinto creed of simplicity and spontaneity. As a poet, he favored the so-called Manyo style. His magnum opus, the Manyo Ko, 1760 to 68, discusses the linguistic aspects and literary value of the Manyoshu. So he was followed by Mabuchi, a voluminous writer of poetry, who in turn was succeeded by Motoori Norinaga, born 1730. So again, there's a note about him. Motoori Norinaga, 1730 to 1801, was the classical scholar of the Edo period who was largely responsible for bringing the Kokugaku national learning movement to its culmination. His works total more than 90 titles and 260 volumes, and are characterized by a rigorous philological approach, a recognition of the emotional nature of man, and a profound sense of reverence for Shinto mythology. His aim was to discern the identity of Japanese culture through an intensive study of the ancient classics, especially the Kojiki. His life work was a study of the Kojiki entitled Kojiki Den. Yes, so Motoori Norinaga, his greatest work was his commentary on the Kojiki. The fourth scholar was Hirata Atsutane, born 1776. So, yes, the Kojiki has a footnote as well. The Kojiki, or Record of Ancient Matters, is Japan's oldest extant chronicle recording events from the mythical age of the gods up to the time of the Empress Suiko, who reigned from 593 to 628. The compiler, Ono Yasumaro, states in the preface that it was presented to the reigning Empress Genmei on 9th March 712. It is divided into three sections. The first section, Jindai no Maki, records the creation of heaven and earth, as well as myths concerning the foundation of Japan. The second section covers the period from Emperor Jimu's reign through the reign of Emperor Ojin at the beginning of the 5th century. The third section records events from the reign of Emperor Nintoku until the rule of Suiko in the early 7th century. The Kojiki places emphasis on myths, legends, and historical and pseudo-historical narratives. It is transcribed in Chinese characters because the Japanese had yet to develop their own syllabic script. Unlike the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki does not present variant or supplementary versions of a story. Okay, so this was Motoori Norinaga's greatest work, was his commentary on the Kojiki. The fourth scholar was Hirata Atsutane, born 1776, who wrote Kodo Tai, the Summary of the Ancient Way, Kodo Tai, the Summary of the Ancient Way, among other works. And again, we've got a footnote on Hirata Atsutane, 1776 to 1843, was a Kokugaku scholar and Shinto theologian. He was the leader of the Restoration Shinto movement known as Fukko Shinto, which strove to revive Shinto by freeing it of debilitating Buddhist and Confucian influences. His nationalist thought strongly influenced the Shishi, loyalist samurai who sought the restoration of direct imperial rule in the late 19th century. It is Fukko Shinto, also known in English as Revival Shinto, Renaissance Shinto, and Pure Shinto, to which Sato is referring in the title of his article. See Kodansha's Japan, an illustrated encyclopedia for details of Fukko Shinto. Okay. Also in 1875, Sato wrote a guidebook to Nikko, published at the Japan Mail Office, which was a detailed guide with historical background, similar in scope to his work on the temples of Ise 1 year previously. In 1876, Sato published an English-Japanese dictionary of the spoken language with M. Ishibashi, a member of the Japanese Foreign Ministry. This dictionary underwent a couple of revisions over the years and was still in use during the Second World War, albeit in a much expanded and altered form. In the following year, he wrote about the introduction of tobacco into Japan, again for the Asiatic Society. This paper was read before the Society on November 10, 1877, and published in volume 6 of the Transactions. Here he discussed the date for the introduction of tobacco, concluding that tobacco was first cultivated in Japan at the beginning of the 17th century, but that it was imported commercially 20 years earlier. Unsuccessful attempts were made to ban the weed from 1612 to 1629. The etymology of various Japanese words connected with smoking is discussed. Sato discounts the notion that the Japanese word for pipe, kiseru, was of European origin. That's kiseru, K-I-S-E-R-U. Woodcuts of Japanese pipes are provided to enliven the text. Merits and demerits of smoking are quoted from the Ensoki, Japanese medical sources are consulted. For example, Kaibara Yoshifuru, who in his Wajishi at the end of the 17th century states that it does more harm than good. Kaibara Yoshifuru may have also been known as Kaibara Ekken, a Confucian scholar who lived from 1630 to 1714 and wrote Yamato Honzo, in which he classified 1,300 kinds of medicinal herbs from China and Japan. 1878 was a particularly active year for Sato's writings. He read 5 separate papers to the Asiatic Society. The first was entitled The Korean Potters in Satsuma, a paper read before the Society on February 23rd, 1878, and published in volume 6 of the Transactions. Sato begins by explaining that pottery was one of the arts brought to Japan from Korea, in particular the delicate white translucent Korean ware to which an antiquity of about 5 centuries is assigned. Since prehistoric times, the Japanese, always ready to learn from others, have at various times invited Korean artisans to settle in Japan and found schools of pottery. This they did in various places, including Kyoto, Rakuyaki, Buzen, Agano ware, and Hagi, Nakano ware. Also, in the province of Satsuma, there is a village entirely inhabited by potters of Korean origin, whose forefathers came from Korea around the time of the withdrawal of Japanese troops from Korea in 1598. They were brought over by Shimazu Yoshihiro, the feudal lord of Satsuma, and most of them were settled in 1603 at Tsuboya, a village between Ichiku and Kagoshima, about 12 miles from the latter town. 17 families settled here. Sato lists their family names. The total population of the village was 1,500. A detailed discussion follows of the pottery which developed from a coarse kind of dark pottery with a black glaze through white Satsuma crackled ware called hibikide to decorated earthenware in the style of coloring called nishikide. In February 1877, Sato visited and stayed at the Korean village of Tsuboya. He noted that the inhabitants all spoke Japanese and wore Japanese dress. This would be from his diaries, which I have published separately. Most of the villagers were producing common brown earthenware. The principle of division of labor was well understood and applied. One workman would make the bodies of teapots, another the lids, a third the spouts, and so on. Sato commented on the clay, glazes, and sizes of wheels. He also described the kilns built up the face of a hill in parallel rows in detail. Well, these would be what we call noborigama, climbing kilns going up the hill or up a slope. The finer kind of earthenware, saishikide and nishikide, required a different kind of white clay and a special kiln. Sato measured the dimensions of the largest of this type of kiln. He also lists the composition of the pigments used for producing the various colors of the fine Satsuma wares. He observed the modeling of figures of Kwannon, that's Kannon, and Dharma in white clay at the pottery belonging to Chin-ju Kuan, and a statuette of Christ after a sentimental woodcut in a religious periodical called The Christian Observer at the Tamanoyama Company's establishment. Tamanoyama Kaisha was a company recently started by some Kagoshima samurai. Finally, one of the potters put on a costume used for special occasions, for example, to honor the Prince of Satsuma on his way to Yedo, Tokyo as we call it now. It comprised a pair of wide trousers of dark blue silk of a very delicate material, a wide-sleeved mantle or haori of light color and texture, and a long conical black cap edged with white. He also produced a broad-brimmed black hat, apparently woven of the stem of a kind of creeper. On March the 9th, 1878, Sato read a very short paper before the Asiatic Society entitled The Use of the Fire Drill in Japan. It was published in volume 6 of the Transactions. This begins, the Japanese Museum at Yedo, Hakubutsukan, possesses a copy of part of the archaic apparatus for kindling fire, called by archaeologists fire drill, and in Japanese, hikiriusu, fire drilling mortar. There follows a detailed description of the utensil and how it works. Sato's third paper of 1878 was also read before the Asiatic Society of Japan on the 22nd of June, 1878, and it's published in volume 6 of the Transactions. Its title was Notes of a Visit to Hachijo in 1878. It was written with Frederick Victor Dickens a noted botanist who was probably responsible for the section on botany. I see that I misspelled Dickens in the original. It's D-I-C-K-I-N-S, not E-N-S. It's not the same as Charles Dickens. Okay. So the island of Hachijo is part of Tokyo-to now. It is the last but one of the chain which extends south of the promontory of Izu in almost a straight line, beginning with the still active volcano Vries, or Barneveld's Island, called Izu no Oshima by the Japanese. Sato begins by quoting Kempfer's account of the island. And we've got a note on Kempfer, footnote. Engelbert Kempfer, 1651 to 1716, German physician and historian, arrived at Nagasaki in September 1690 to become physician at the Dutch factory on the island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbor. In 1691 and 1692, he accompanied the annual Dutch tribute mission, Edo Sampu, to the shogun's court at Edo. His meticulous accounts of these journeys are published in his History of Japan, 1727-8, which appeared in Dutch, French, and German editions. Sato quotes from the edition of London, 1727. So Sato begins by quoting Kempfer's account of the island, which he says reads almost like a passage from the Arabian Nights, and which contains many incorrect statements. Hachijo was a place of banishment for court nobles, but not before 1603. Also, the statement that the coast is so steep and rocky that the only way of gaining access is by being drawn up by a crane, boat and all is an absurd exaggeration. The first Europeans known to have landed on the island were from a British man of war, probably HMS Raleigh, about 40 years back. That would be 1838. HMS Action also landed several persons in September 1871. However, on neither of these occasions was a thorough exploration of the island attempted, which would have served to correct the account given by Kempfer. Sato then begins his own account of the island. First, he locates it precisely and gives its dimensions. He notes, at the northwest end rises the volcanic peak to which the name of Fuji has been given by the inhabitants after the great mountain on the mainland. He gives great detail of the topography and terrain, stressing that the structure of the island is entirely volcanic. With regard to the inhabitants, he says that they are nearly all occupied in the cultivation of the soil, more of which is reclaimed every year. The Satsuma potato, Batatas edulis, appears to form the staple food of the islanders. That would be what we call Satsumaimo in Japanese now, and to be produced in much larger quantities than the other two articles, which were rice and barley. Alcohol was available in the form of potato brandy, distilled from the Satsuma potato, and nigori sake, brewed from rice. That's a kind of muddy sake, it's not clear. Of the latter, Sato comments that it resembles slate pencil dust stirred up in muddy water and tastes somewhat like very sour vin ordinaire. Fish is very rarely an article of food, as it can be procured only in calm weather, either by fishing with a hook and line or by diving. The latter method consists in pursuing the fish with a barbed point fastened to a long cord and fitted onto the end of an iron skewer furnished with a wooden handle. When the diver finds himself near enough, he stabs the fish, which makes off carrying the barbed point attached to the cord, leaving the skewer in the diver's hand. And after it has tired itself out, it is easily secured and brought to land. The main manufacture of the island is silk weaving. A considerable quantity of raw silk is imported annually from Yedo by a few of the richer farmers, and after being dyed and woven, the material is exported as genuine hachijo. The only other manufacture is that of salt from sea water, which is obtained in an extremely wasteful and primitive manner. Sato found no shops or inns on the island, but fair accommodation for travelers can be obtained at the farmers' houses. He describes the houses and godowns in detail. Godown is a warehouse. Of the lives of the people, he says, in their general habits of life, the people do not appear to differ greatly from the agricultural population of any other part of Japan. The men occupy themselves chiefly with cultivating the ground and cutting wood, and in their leisure hours they appear to smoke a great deal of bad leaf tobacco grown on the island and to drink as much potato spirit as possible. That would be imo jochu, I suppose. The women take no part in fieldwork, but busy themselves with the domestic duties proper to their sex, to which they add the breeding of silkworms, the preparation of the thread, and the labors of the loom. They are by no means hardly treated and enjoy a as high a degree of social freedom as anywhere in the world. Sato met several exiles banished to Hachijo. One had originally been a monk of the Honganji at Kyoto, but had quitted the black robe to enter the service of the retainer of the daimyo of Tosa. After accompanying into the field the troops which were engaged in the reduction of Aizu in 1868, he returned to Yedo and had the misfortune to wound a comrade in a quarrel, for which he was punished with perpetual exile. He had returned to his original profession, in which he had conducted himself so well that a pardon had been promised to him. A second exile had murdered half a dozen innocent people, but had become an authority on the past history of the island. A third had been the head of a temple at Senji, a suburb of Yedo. He was caught in a house of public resort in Yoshiwara and punished with exile for life. That would be a brothel. The final section of the article comprises an investigation of the dialect of Hachijo. This includes dialogues given in Romaji and English in the same style as that used in Kuaiwa Hen, published in 1873. Sato's fourth paper in 1878 was entitled Ancient Japanese Rituals, number 1, Praying for Harvest, and was read to the Asiatic Society of Japan on a date between June the 22nd and November 27th. There's a footnote here. The sequel to this paper, entitled Ancient Japanese Rituals Part 2, was read before the Asiatic Society on June the 30th, 1879. It was divided into the following sections: Kasuga Matsuri, or the service of the gods of Kasuga; Hirose Ohoimi no Matsuri, service of the goddess of food; and Tatsuta Kaze no Kami no Matsuri, service of the gods of wind at Tatsuta. Translation of rituals and copious notes are provided in volume 7 of the Transactions. Sato's fifth paper in 1878 was read before the Asiatic Society of Japan on November 27, 1878, and published in volume 7 of the Transactions. Its title was Vicissitudes of the Church at Yamaguchi from 1550 to 1586. Here, for the first time, we see Sato embrace a Christian theme. A footnote says, Sato was finally confirmed in the Anglican faith on October 29, 1888, at St. Paul's Cathedral by the Bishop of London. This is quoting B.M. Allen's memoir of Sato, page 93. Sato expresses profound regret that the conversion of the inhabitants to the religion of Europe encountered such powerful hostile influences that after an extraordinary success had been achieved during the first half century, the tide turned back and excluded the nation from the pale of Christendom up to this day. He traces the story of Christianity in Japan from the founding of the Jesuit mission at Yamaguchi by St. Francis Xavier. Again, there's a footnote. Francis Xavier is the anglicized form of the Spanish name Francisco de Javier. Born in northern Basque Spain in 1506, he studied at the University of Paris and was a founding member of the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. Appointed apostolic delegate for Asia, he left Europe in 1541 and labored in India and Malacca. In 1547, he met in Malacca a Japanese fugitive named Anjiro, the brother Paul referred to by Sato. Anjiro's glowing account of his native country fired Xavier with enthusiasm to evangelize Japan. Xavier was in Japan from 15th of August 1549 to the end of 1551, when he left Japan for India. His ultimate purpose was to evangelize the Chinese, but he died en route to China on the 3rd of December 1552. Sato traces the story of Christianity in Japan from the founding of the Jesuit mission at Yamaguchi by St. Francis Xavier, whose first letter from there is dated on the 20th of November 1550 and addressed to the Society of Jesus at Goa. The letter reported that after passing a year at Kagoshima, where he had arrived on the 15th of August 1549, making more than 100 converts with the aid of Brother Paul, and studying the language, he left that city about the beginning of July 1550 and proceeded to Hirado. That's in the west of Kyushu, an island. Here he and his companions made nearly 100 more converts in a few days. From there he went on to Kyoto, but on arriving there, he found the city full of armed men and in a state bordering on anarchy, which did not appear likely to favor his attempts to make proselytes, and the two missionaries therefore retraced their steps to Yamaguchi. Sato describes Ohochi Yoshitaka, the then ruler of Yamaguchi, to whom Xavier presented letters of credence and presents from the Portuguese Viceroy of India and the Bishop of Goa. The presents included a clock and a harpsichord. Yoshitaka greatly appreciated these and offered a considerable sum of money in silver and gold in return. However, Xavier declined to receive it and begged instead for permission to preach Christianity, which was readily granted. A proclamation was published declaring that the king approved of the introduction of the new religion and granting to the people perfect liberty to embrace it. And an empty Buddhist monastery was assigned to the missionaries as a residence. Their operations were attended with great success. 500 converts were made in a couple of months. Yet there was a great deal of anti-Christian feeling also with which the missionaries had to contend in subsequent years, largely stirred up by warring Japanese factions. Sato traces the vicissitudes of the Jesuits through a study of these wars and through letters addressed by the missionaries to Goa and Portugal. He also discovered the identity of the two names Kondera and Kuroda, i.e. they were both the same person. This identity has been hitherto overlooked by everyone who has written on the subject of the Roman Catholic missions in Japan. After the Annus Mirabilis of 1878, we find Sato the writer in full cry through the following 4 years before his return to England on leave in 1883. In 1879, he wrote a paper on the transliteration of the Japanese syllabary, which was published in volume 7 of the Transactions of the Asiatic Society. This begins with a discussion of names, na, and how the ancient Japanese began by learning those Chinese characters which represented what we call substantives, or rather nouns, and to which they naturally applied the word na, name, extending it afterwards to others which denoted qualities, actions, and relations. Mention is made of the earliest extant attempt to form a dictionary, namely the Wamyo-sho, or transcription of Japanese names, composed by the famous Minamoto no Shitagao. So Minamoto no Shitagao is a footnote, 911 to 983, often spelt Shitago. A major literary figure of the mid-10th century, one of the Sanju Rokkasen, 36 poetic geniuses. He was also one of the so-called 5 men of the Pear Chamber, Nashitsubo no Gonin, who were chosen by Emperor Murakami in 951 to compile the second imperial anthology of Japanese poetry, the Gosen Wakashu, and also to make a scholarly study of the Manyoshu. His works include the Wamyo Rui Jusho or Wamyosho, to which Sato refers. So Minamoto no Shitago, which is a collection of Chinese characters. Yeah, this is the Wamyosho, is a collection of Chinese characters with definitions of their meaning and the Japanese equivalents, all of which are nouns substantive. Sato says that it cannot be stated with certainty at what period the Chinese writing system was introduced into Japan. However, we have in the Kojiki, 711 AD, the positive statement that the 1,000-character composition, Senjimon, was one of the first books brought to Japan by the Korean Wani. This book did not exist before the 6th century, and Sato reasons that it certainly could not have reached Japan by way of Korea much before the middle of the 6th century AD. The article goes on to discuss the introduction of Chinese literature into Japan, the idea of using Chinese characters to spell Japanese words, the development of katakana and hiragana, alternative romanizations, and so on. On January 13th, 1880, Sato read a reply to Dr. Edkins on Chi and Su before the Asiatic Society. In his paper on the transliteration of the syllabary, published in volume 8 of the Transactions, Sato said that there was nothing to show that Chi and Ti T were ever identical, and that there does not exist any evidence in support of the supposition that Su and Chi are corruptions of Tu and Ti. This was challenged by Edkins, but Sato sought to refute his arguments in a brief but scholarly manner. On April 13th, 1880, Sato read another paper entitled Ancient Sepulchral Mounds in Kozuke to the Society. It was published in volume 8 of the Transactions and included 41 illustrations and descriptions of pottery found in the burial mounds. Kozuke is in the neighborhood of the village of Omuro, which is about 7 miles east of Maebashi in Gunma Prefecture. The paper included a discussion of the ancient Japanese custom of burying human beings and horses at the tombs of chieftains, for which clay figures were afterwards substituted. Reference is made to the Nihongi regarding the practice. Yes, and there's a footnote about the Nihongi or Nihon Shokki, Chronicle of Japan, the oldest official history of Japan covering events from the mythical age of the gods up to the reign of the Empress Jito, 686 to 697. The Nihon Shokki was completed on the 1st of July, 720. The Nihon Shokki's 30 volumes plus 1 volume of genealogical charts are the work of many people, including Prince Toneri, a son of Emperor Temmu, and possibly Fujiwara no Fuhito, a powerful figure in the government. Although the official name of the work was Nihongi, other early documents refer to it as Nihon Shokki. The first edition of a handbook for travelers in central and northern Japan was published in 1881. A second revised edition was published by John Murray in London with Kelly and Company, Yokohama in 1884. The handbook was authored jointly by Sato and Lieutenant A.G.S. Hawes, that's Albert George Sidney Hawes, H-A-W-E-S, of the Royal Marines, and many friends contributed, including Basil Hall Chamberlain, about whom there is a footnote. Basil Hall Chamberlain, 1850 to 1935, was one of the foremost Western interpreters of things Japanese, born of a distinguished family in Southampton, England on 18th of October, 1850, educated in Europe and England. His father intended him to be a banker, but at age 18, he became ill. His physician recommended travel, and Chamberlain landed in Japan on 29th of May, 1873. So he was about 23, or not, no, 22 at the time. He taught at the Imperial Navy School in Tokyo from 1874 to 1882. His most important position, however, was as professor of Japanese at Tokyo University beginning in 1886. It was here that he gained his reputation as a student of Japanese language and literature. His many works include the translation of the Kojiki into English in 1906, a Handbook of Colloquial Japanese, 1888, Things Japanese, 1890, and a Practical Guide to the Study of Japanese Writing, 1905. With W.B. Mason, he wrote a Handbook for Travelers in Japan, 1891, which grew out of Sato and Hawes' handbook and went through numerous editions. He retired to Geneva, Switzerland in 1911. Okay, so the handbook had various contributors, including Chamberlain, W.G. Aston, and of course there is a footnote on him as well. William George Aston, 1841 to 1911, was a British diplomat and Japanologist. He was born in Northern Ireland, arriving in Japan in 1864, 2 years after Sato. He worked for the British legation during the late Edo and early Meiji periods, first serving as an interpreter and later as Hyogo, now Kobe, consul and secretary to the legation in Tokyo. In addition to a translation of the Nihon Shokki, published 1896, he was the author of such works as A History of Japanese Literature, 1899, and Shinto, 1905, as well as the first English language grammar of spoken and written Japanese. He also made a comparative study of Japanese and the Indo-European languages. All right, so W.G. Aston contributed pictorial and glyptic art. Frederick Victor Dickens contributed zoology and biology. And J.J. Rhine, geography and climate. J.J. Rhine, there is a footnote, Johann Justus Rhine. And in the most recent China correspondence, I found a letter from Rhine to Sato in, I think it was 1905. Anyway, Rhein was born 1835, died 1918, a professor of geography at Bonn University. There is a memorial inscribed to his memory in Shiramine, Ishikawa Prefecture, which records his collecting of plant fossils there in July 1874, as well as his contribution to the education of Japanese students during his tenure at Bonn from 1883 to 1910. Since 1981, the Rhein Hakase Kensho Kai has met annually in Shiramine to commemorate Rhein. Lectures are published in the Rhein Sai. See Beiträge zur Geschichte der Geographie an der Universität Bonn, Colloquium Geographicum, Bund 21, Bonn 1991, pages 196 to 205, Johann Justus Rhein by Gerhard Eimans. So Rhein wrote about geography and climate in the handbook. Sato himself wrote the sections on Shinto and Buddhism. The book was divided into an introduction containing general articles and routes, beginning with Tokyo and environs and ending with excursions from Nagasaki. Maps and plans were also provided. Ernest Sato's last two papers, published by the Asiatic Society of Japan before his return to England in 1883, were on the early history of printing in Japan, read on December the 15th, 1881, and a follow-up entitled Further Notes on Movable Types in Korea and Early Printed Japanese Books, read on June the 21st, 1882. Both papers were subsequently published in volume 10 of the Transactions of the Society. The former is divided into the following sections: 1, block books; 2, printing with movable types, block books of the same period, and pictorial wood engraving. The history of block printing is traced from 175 AD in China through its introduction in 8th century Japan up to the 17th century. Printing with movable types of clay may have begun in the middle of the 11th century in China, but Sato could find no evidence to corroborate this. He mentions many 14th century Korean texts and dates the introduction of movable types into Japan with little doubt to the end of the 16th century. After the first invasion of Korea by the armies of Hideyoshi, a large quantity of Korean movable type books were brought back by one of his generals, Ukida Hidehei. So again, there's a footnote, Ukida Hidehei, actually. 1572 to 1655, a daimyo of the Azuchi Momoyama period, 1568 to 1600. Hidehei succeeded his father Nao-ie, 1529 to 81, in lordship of a large domain centered on Okayama in Bizen province. Hidehei was a favorite of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who gave him his adopted daughter Go-hime in marriage. Hidehei served in various campaigns, including the invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597. He became one of the 5 great elders, Gotairo, of the Toyotomi regime in 1595. In the Battle of Sekigahara, 1600, Hidehei opposed Tokugawa Ieyasu. Defeated, he lost his great domain and fled to Kyushu, seeking the protection of the Shimazu family of Kagoshima. In 1603, the Shimazu delivered Hidehei to the Tokugawa. In 1606, he was exiled to the island of Hachijo, where he lived until his death. So, going back to the main text, a large quantity of Korean movable type books were brought back by one of his generals, Ukida Hidehei, which formed the model on which the Japanese printers worked. The latter paper is a brief addendum to the main paper after Sato was allowed to examine 2 of the early Korean printed books mentioned in the main paper, the Sun Tzu Shi-chia-chu of 1409 and the Li Tai Chiang Chien Poi of 1437. He was enabled to do this through the courtesy of Mr. Shigeno, the then director of the Imperial Historiographical Bureau. So another footnote about Shigeno. Shigeno Yasutsugo, 1827 to 1920, historian born in Satsuma. He studied at the Shoheiko, the Shogunate Academy in Edo. After the Meiji Restoration, 1868, he supervised the compilation of historical records at the Office of Historiography, Shushikyoku. Shigeno was appointed professor of history at Tokyo University in 1888. Adamantly opposed to the moralistic use of history, he was forced to resign in 1893 after attacks by Shinto nationalists. So Sato was enabled to examine these books through the courtesy of Mr. Shigeno, the then director of the Imperial Historiographical Bureau. Concluding remarks. The above is a summary of the first 17 years of Sato's productive life as a Japanologist. It is most striking that he was able to produce such work at the same time as learning the Japanese language, of which he quickly became an acknowledged master, and working as a secretary to Her Majesty's legation. The range and depth of his scholarship is equally fascinating. Ernest Mason Sato not only wrote about Japan, but the bulk of his published work was related to Japan. The works cited above are about half of his total scholarly output. I have made no mention here of his best-known book, A Diplomat in Japan, which comprises his personal memoirs of the years 1862 to 69. It lies outside the scope of this article, both chronologically and thematically. Chronologically, because it was first published in 1921. And I have a footnote. This article, arranged from a lecture delivered to the Kansai branch of the Japan Association of Comparative Culture, Nihon Hikaku Bunka Gakkai, on Japan through the eyes of E.M. Sato at Doshisha University, Kyoto, on September 17th, 1994. Finally, Sir George Sansom's assessment should be noted. And again, we have a footnote about Sansom. George Bailey Sansom, 1883 to 1965, diplomat, historian, and doyen of Japanese studies. After entering the British consular service at age 19, he was sent to the Far East in 1904 and began a career in Japan that lasted until World War II. In 1928, he published an historical grammar of Japanese, and in 1931, Japan, A Short Cultural History. In 1951, while at Columbia University, he wrote The Western World and Japan. An appointment to Stanford University enabled him to undertake his major scholarly work, the 3-volume A History of Japan, 1958 to 1963. Anyway, here is what Sir George Sansom wrote about Sato. Sato was perhaps a rather dry scholar, but he was a prodigious worker. Besides being a most valuable member of the British legation in Japan at a crucial period, he added to his understanding of Japanese politics a remarkable command of the Japanese language and a scholar's interest in Japanese history and literature. Much of his work is still not superseded. He is one of the founding fathers of modern Japanology. This is from Journal of Asian Studies, volume 24, number 4, page 566, August 1965. And I end this with thanks. I wish to record my gratitude to the librarians of Kyushu Institute of Technology for their hard work in obtaining copies of all of Sato's papers mentioned above, except for a guidebook to Nikko, which I found in the British Library in July 1994. And then there is a bibliography. The Right Honourable Sir E.M. Sato, GCMG, a memoir by B.M. Allen, Keegan Paul, Trench Trubner and Company Limited, London, 1933. Japan, an illustrated encyclopedia, Kodansha, first edition, Tokyo, 1993. Britain and Japan, Themes and Personalities, Routledge, first edition, London, 1991. Chapter 4 on Sato is by P.F. Kornitsky of the Japan Research Center at the University of Cambridge. And a Japanese book, Oyatoi Gaikokujin, Kyoiku Shukyo, by Shigehisa Tokutaro, Kashima Kenkyu Sho Shuppankai, 1964. And finally, it says that I teach at Kyushu Institute of Technology, which I did when I wrote this and did until retirement. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. If you've listened and or watched and up to this point, thank you.